Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today into a topic you guys seem really interested in, disasters and the impact they have on mental health. And we've got a pretty hefty pile of research to go through.
We do.
We've got this really comprehensive book, Disasters in Mental Health, and then a bunch of chapters that focus on specific events.
Yeah.
The Athens earthquake, the Nairobi U.S. Embassy bombing, 9/11, Chernobyl.
The Kobe earthquake.
Oh, the Kobe earthquake, yeah.
Yeah.
The Marmara earthquake, and even the Bhopal disaster.
A lot to unpack.
Right. And I think we all know, I mean, disasters are awful, devastating. But this research kind of goes beyond just the surface level, like how bad these events are.
Mm.
What are some of the things, when you look at all this, what are some of the things that maybe aren't so obvious that surprised you?
Well, one thing that really stood out to me is how a disaster isn't just defined by the event itself. It's really more about society's ability to cope with it.
Okay.
So, you could have a huge flood, but if it's in an uninhabited area, it doesn't really meet the definition of a disaster in this framework.
Oh, interesting.
It's really the disruption to those social systems, that challenge to our sense of order and control that really defines a disaster.
So it's not just about the physical damage, but about like that rupture in our shared reality.
Yeah, exactly. And that kind of brings me to a quote from the book that I thought was really interesting. It says, "A disaster is an empirical falsification of human action, the proof of the incorrectness of human beings' conceptions on nature and culture."
Whoa. Okay. That's a lot.
Yeah.
But I think what they're getting at is, we think we have things figured out, and then a disaster comes along and says, nope, you don't.
Exactly. It's like this mirror, right? It's being held up to all our assumptions about the world, and it reveals all these cracks in those assumptions.
Yeah. Okay, I'm with you. So even in like the events that seem totally outside of our control, like a natural disaster, there's this element of human responsibility.
There is.
And that's kind of a tough pill to swallow sometimes.
It is.
Yeah.
But it's also empowering in a way. It means we can actually make changes.
Yeah.
We're not just passive victims. We have the ability to influence outcomes.
That's a good point. Okay, so we've kind of got this framework for understanding what a disaster is. Now let's talk about the fallout, the psychological impact. And I know a lot of times people focus on PTSD, but what surprised you about all the different mental health stuff that can happen after a disaster? Like, what did the research say?
I think what really surprised me is just how varied the responses can be. You have the classic PTSD, of course, with the flashbacks and the nightmares, the avoidance.
Right.
But you also see a lot of what's called somatization.
Somatization.
Yeah, it's basically where that psychological distress turns into like physical symptoms.
Oh, wow.
So people might have like headaches or digestive issues, chronic pain.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's really hard to link those things back to that initial trauma.
Yeah, I guess it makes sense though, right? Trauma affects the whole person, not just your mind. It's just, yeah, not always easy to connect those dots.
Right. And then there's the ripple effect on relationships and work and substance use. All these areas of life can be totally disrupted.
It's like it's not just about individual suffering, but about like a breakdown in that social fabric that we were talking about.
Absolutely.
So it's this whole web of consequences, not just one diagnosis. What about PTSD though? There's been so much research lately. Anything new there that stood out?
One thing that's become really clear is that PTSD isn't one size fits all. The symptoms can be so different, and even the things that trigger those symptoms can be really unexpected. It's not always about reliving the event itself. It could be a smell, a sound, even just a certain time of year that sets off all that anxiety and fear.
So it's like the trauma gets like embedded like in your nervous system,
Right.
waiting to be reactivated by like totally random stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
It makes you think about that long-term impact,
Yeah.
especially for people who've gone through multiple traumas.
Absolutely. And researchers are starting to look into those long-term effects, like how trauma can actually change the structure and function of the brain.
No kidding.
Yeah. For example, there's some studies that have shown that people with PTSD tend to have a smaller hippocampus. That's the part of the brain that helps with memory and emotional regulation.
So we're talking about real physical changes in the brain. It's not just like, get over it,
Right. It's this really complex interplay of biological and psychological and social factors.
Okay. So we've talked about all these mental health consequences, but now I got to ask the big question. Why do some people seem to bounce back from these horrific things and others, they really struggle for years? What makes someone resilient?
Well, it's definitely not about being tough or having some superpower. It's more about resources, internal resources and external resources.
Okay.
And one key factor is social support. People who have those strong connections with family and friends and community, they tend to do better.
It's that sense of belonging, right? Knowing that you're not alone in it.
Exactly. And it's not just about receiving support either. It's also about giving it, contributing to your community, helping other people. That can be really empowering, and it helps to build resilience too.
It's that two-way street again. Okay, so external stuff, that social support network. What about the internal resources? What kind of things about a person can help them through a trauma?
One really important factor is a sense of self-efficacy.
Self-efficacy.
Yeah, it's basically the belief that you have some control over your situation.
Okay.
Even when you're facing these huge challenges, it's not about denying the reality of what's happening. It's about focusing on what you can do, even if it's just taking small steps.
Yeah, it's about those little wins, those little pockets of like where you can make choices and take action.
Yeah. And it kind of ties into coping mechanisms too.
Mhm.
People who have those healthy ways of dealing with stress, like exercise or meditation or talking to a therapist,
Right.
they tend to be more resilient as well.
So it's not about avoiding the bad feelings, but it's about having tools to manage those feelings.
Mhm.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Now, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about how a disaster can be like an empirical falsification of all our assumptions.
Yeah, it really challenges our worldview.
Do you think that's like part of what makes it so damaging?
Yeah.
That our reality gets disrupted?
That's a really interesting question.
And then, like, on the flip side, could embracing that disruption, like questioning those assumptions, could that be a path towards being more resilient?
I think that's a great point. It gets to the heart of what makes us human, our need to make sense of the world, to create order out of chaos. And when a disaster hits, it shatters that order. And I think part of the trauma is that struggle to reconcile our experience with what we thought we knew about how the world works.
It's like a cognitive earthquake.
Yeah, exactly.
Shaking the foundations of everything you thought you knew.
But I think you're right. It's also an opportunity. If we can embrace that uncertainty, that questioning, it can help us grow.
Okay.
Maybe we come out of it with a more, nuanced understanding of the world, a greater appreciation for the things we took for granted.
So it's about letting go of the need for like certainty,
Mhm.
for absolute control. Instead, leaning into that ambiguity, the complexity. That sounds kind of terrifying.
It can be,
Yeah.
but it can also be liberating.
Yeah.
And I think that's where real resilience lies. It's not about going back to how things were, but about building something new and stronger from all that rubble.
Okay. I think we've laid some good groundwork here,
Yeah.
exploring the nature of disasters and how they really can mess with our minds.
Right.
But let's get specific. In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to actually delve into those case studies you mentioned. Like, how did these concepts play out in real-world events? The Nairobi bombing, Chernobyl, 9/11, and more. Get ready for some really powerful stories and some pretty surprising insights.
I'm excited to dive into those. Those cases really bring all this research to life.
Me too. We'll be back soon to continue our exploration.
Welcome back. I'm really looking forward to getting into these case studies. I think each one offers a really interesting perspective on this whole disaster and mental health thing.
Yeah, me too. Last time we were talking about how a disaster isn't just about like the event itself, it's about a society's ability to cope, and that really got me thinking about how those coping mechanisms can be so different depending on where you are in the world.
Absolutely. Culture, resources, even like political stuff that's already going on. It all plays a role in the mental health consequences.
Right. So let's get specific. What about the Nairobi U.S. Embassy bombing? That one with all the geopolitical stuff, that seems especially complicated.
It was a terrible act of terrorism, and the research had some interesting observations about how that community dealt with it. One thing that really struck me was the role of the media. Like, they went beyond just reporting what happened. They actually got involved in educating people about mental health.
Huh. I don't usually think about the media as a mental health resource, but I guess in that kind of situation, they can reach a lot of people.
Exactly. And they used that platform to try to get rid of the stigma around getting help. They said over and over that psychological trauma was a normal reaction to something that was definitely not normal. And they shared information about all the resources that were available.
So it was about making those reactions seem normal so people didn't feel like they were the only ones going through it. Did the research mention any challenges that came up when they were trying to provide mental health care in that situation?
Yeah, one big thing was that they needed counseling that was sensitive to the culture.
Right.
Kenya has a really diverse population, and those interventions had to be tailored to all those different beliefs and practices. Like,
Mhm.
you can't just have a one-size-fits-all approach.
That makes me wonder, were there specific groups that had even more challenges? What about pregnant women or people with disabilities? Did they talk about that?
You're right, that's an important point. The research did say that those groups usually need more specialized support to deal with their specific needs.
Okay.
For example, pregnant women might be really anxious about their babies,
Mm-mm.
and people with disabilities might have trouble even accessing services.
Mm.
It really shows how vulnerability comes in a lot of different forms, and you have to understand those different forms to be truly effective.
Okay. Let's switch gears completely and talk about Chernobyl. That one is so different. The threat is radiation. You can't even see it.
Mm.
I'm curious if the research talked about how that invisibility affects people's minds.
It did. Chernobyl really shows how fear, especially fear of the unknown, can be just as bad as physical danger.
Yeah.
The research talked about this huge sense of anxiety and uncertainty that stuck around for years after the explosion.
It makes sense. We want to feel in control. And when we can't see the threat or understand it, that takes away our sense of control.
Right. And in Chernobyl, that fear was made even worse because at first, the Soviet government tried to keep everything secret, and they tried to downplay how bad it was.
So it was like a double whammy, this invisible radiation and then being lied to by the people in charge.
Yeah. It really shows how important it is to be clear and honest during a crisis. When people feel like they're being kept in the dark, it makes them mistrustful, and that just makes the anxiety worse.
It really does. Okay, let's talk about 9/11. I think that's a disaster that really changed the way Americans think. What did the research say about the mental health consequences?
9/11 was a trauma for the entire country, not just for the people who were directly affected.
Right.
The research found PTSD, anxiety, and depression were everywhere after the attacks.
Mm.
But even beyond the diagnoses, it showed a big shift in our sense of safety. Like, suddenly, the world felt a lot less predictable, a lot more dangerous.
It did, didn't it?
And that has a huge impact on our mental health. People were more vigilant, suspicious. It made people lose trust in the institutions that are supposed to keep us safe.
You know, earlier you were talking about how the media in Nairobi helped promote mental health awareness. Did the research talk about what the media did after 9/11?
It did. It's a complicated story. On the one hand, they kept showing the attacks on TV, and that probably hurt some people. But on the other hand, it also helped create a shared narrative.
Oh.
It gave people a way to process what happened, to feel connected to other people who were going through the same thing.
So it was both good and bad.
Yeah. And I think it shows how important media literacy is. Especially these days with news and social media coming at us 24/7. We have to be careful about how we consume information, especially during a crisis, and try to find sources that are giving us good information, but also supporting us.
Okay, so we've talked about terrorism, a nuclear disaster, and 9/11. Let's look at something totally different. The Bhopal gas leak in India.
Yeah.
This was an industrial accident, just
Mm.
awful, and it had consequences that lasted for a long time. What stood out to you about this one?
Bhopal really shows how disasters can have a ripple effect that goes way beyond the event itself. The gas leak was horrible, but the mental health struggles that the community had to deal with for years afterward were made even worse by things like poverty and bad health care.
And probably the fact that the company was negligent, right?
Yes. The research on Bhopal really shows how we need to have a holistic approach to disaster response. It's not enough to just take care of people's immediate physical needs. We have to think about the long-term psychological, social, and economic consequences too.
So it's not just about bouncing back, it's about making things better than they were before, fixing the things that made communities vulnerable in the first place.
Exactly. And that brings us to another earthquake, this time in Kobe, Japan.
Kobe, yeah.
This one is interesting because it shows how cultural factors can change how we understand and respond to trauma.
I'm really curious about that. Japan is so different culturally from all the other examples we've talked about. Did that affect their mental health response?
Yeah, one thing that was really striking was the focus on social harmony in Japanese culture and not wanting to lose face. This had a big impact on how people coped. They didn't want to talk openly about how much they were suffering because they were afraid of disrupting social order or being a burden on other people.
So even when people are going through unimaginable loss, being stoic was more important. Did that make it hard to figure out who needed help?
It did. Mental health professionals had to be aware of those cultural norms and figure out how to support people without making them go against what they believed in.
Wow.
Like group therapy ended up being more effective than one-on-one therapy because it gave people a chance to connect without having to talk about their own personal struggles directly.
That's a great example of how there's not one right way to do mental health care. It has to fit the culture and respect people's values.
Exactly. Now, for our last earthquake, the one in Marmara, Turkey, this one was especially sad because it happened in a region that was already struggling with political and economic problems.
So they were already dealing with so much, and then this earthquake hit. What kind of mental health challenges did they face?
The earthquake just made all the existing inequalities worse.
Of course.
The people who were already the most vulnerable were hit the hardest. They usually didn't have as much access to resources, both physical and mental, which made coping with the trauma so much harder.
So it's not just the earthquake itself, it's all those other problems that were already there. Did the research talk about any successes in providing mental health support?
There were some good things.
Okay, good.
The research talked about how resilient the Turkish people are and how strong their community bonds are. That really helped them recover.
Yeah.
And there were a ton of volunteers, both from Turkey and from other countries, who helped meet people's immediate needs and provide psychological first aid.
That's so great to hear. Seeing communities come together like that is really inspiring.
It is. It really shows the power of collective action and how important it is to build strong communities, both before and after a disaster.
Okay, so we've gone through a lot of case studies. What are the big takeaways for you? What have we learned about disasters and how they affect our mental health?
I think the main thing is that disaster mental health is really complex. There's not one solution that will work for everyone. We have to consider the type of event, the culture, the resources, and how vulnerable different groups are. But even with all that complexity, there's still hope.
What do you mean?
Well, we've seen how communities can come together, how people can become more resilient, and how even when people experience incredible loss, the human spirit finds a way to heal and rebuild.
That's a great point. Okay, let's talk about resilience. We've used that word a lot, but we haven't really defined it. What does it mean to be resilient after a disaster?
Being resilient isn't about not feeling pain or pretending that everything's fine. It's about being able to adapt and cope and even grow when you're going through something really difficult. It's about acknowledging the pain and loss, but also finding the strength to keep going, to fix what's broken, and find meaning in the middle of the chaos.
So it's not like a destination, it's a journey.
Yes, it's a process. And it's not something you either have or don't have. It's something you work on and build over time.
And hope is a big part of that, right?
It is. Hope is what keeps us going. It gives us the energy to move forward, the belief that things can get better even when things are really hard.
So how do we find hope for ourselves and for other people, especially after a disaster? It seems so hard when you've lost everything.
It is difficult.
Yeah.
But I think it starts with changing our focus.
Okay.
Instead of thinking about what we've lost, we need to think about what's still possible. We need to look for those small moments of hope, those little things that are still good, that remind us that life goes on.
So it's like a practice. Like we have to make an effort to find those moments.
Right. And those moments can be really powerful, even if they're small.
Like what? Give me an example.
Like seeing a flower growing in the rubble, or seeing people being kind to each other. It's about teaching ourselves to look for those signs of life, even when everything seems dark.
So it's a choice to see the good even when everything feels bad. What about stories? Do you think they can help people find hope?
We've been talking about those case studies, and those are stories, right? Stories of people being resilient.
Stories are incredibly powerful. They help us understand the world, connect with other people, and find meaning in what we're going through. And when we hear stories about people overcoming really hard things, it gives us hope that we can do it too.
It's like they're showing us the way, even if the path seems impossible.
Right. And it doesn't have to be these huge stories about heroes. Sometimes the most powerful stories are about regular people coping, rebuilding, and finding joy, even when they're sad. Those stories show us that resilience isn't about doing amazing things. It's about those small, everyday acts of courage that keep us going. Welcome back, everyone. It feels like we've gone through so much already, but I'm really excited to get into this last part of our deep dive. We spent a lot of time talking about the hard stuff, the psychological fallout from disasters. But what I keep coming back to is resilience. How people find strength and meaning even when they've been through something truly awful.
It really is amazing. It's not about ignoring the pain or pretending that things are okay. It's about recognizing the bad stuff, but still believing that there's good out there too.
Right. And that's where hope comes in, right? We touched on it a bit in the last part, but I want to go a little deeper. How do we cultivate hope, both in ourselves and in others, after a disaster? Because it seems like when your whole world has been turned upside down, hope would be the first thing to disappear.
It's definitely a challenge, but one important thing is to change what we're focusing on.
Okay.
Instead of focusing on what we've lost, we need to look at what's still possible. Look for those little sparks of hope, those small moments of beauty or connection that show us that even in the middle of all the devastation, life goes on.
So it's like a practice. Like we have to intentionally look for those moments.
Exactly. And those moments can be so powerful.
Like what?
It could be something small, like seeing a flower growing in the rubble, or seeing two people being kind to each other, even though they've both lost everything. It's our training ourselves to look for those signs of life, those tiny bits of hope, even when things seem really dark.
So it's a choice. We choose to see the good, even when everything feels bad. I wonder, do you think stories play a role in this? Because we've been talking about those case studies, and those are stories, right? Stories of people who've found a way to be resilient.
Absolutely. Stories are incredibly powerful. They help us understand the world, connect with each other, and find meaning in our own experiences. And when we hear about people overcoming huge challenges, it can really inspire us and give us hope that we can get through our own tough times too.
It's like those stories give us a map, showing us that even when the path seems impossible, other people have found their way.
You got it. And it doesn't have to be these big heroic stories. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the simple ones.
Yeah.
Stories about everyday people coping and rebuilding and finding happiness even when they're grieving. Those stories teach us that resilience isn't about doing extraordinary things. It's about the little everyday acts of bravery and kindness that help us keep going.
Okay, so we've talked about changing our focus, looking for those little bits of hope, and finding inspiration in stories. But what about things we can actually do? What are some practical steps we can take to build resilience in ourselves and in our communities?
Well, one really important step is to make our support network stronger.
Okay.
We already know that feeling connected to others is one of the best ways to protect ourselves from stress and trauma. So put time and energy into those relationships. Take care of your friendships, spend time with your family, get involved in your community.
It's about building that web of support around you, knowing you have people you can count on when things get hard.
That's it. And it's not just about getting support, it's about giving it too. Helping others, doing things that make a difference in the world. That can be really powerful. It can make you feel stronger too.
That's that two-way street again. Okay, so we've got that external support system, but what about things we can do for ourselves? Are there specific habits or things we can practice that can make us more resilient?
Absolutely. Exercise is a good example.
Okay.
It's not just good for your body, it's great for your mind too. It reduces stress, improves your mood, and it can even help you process trauma.
Wow, so getting our bodies moving can help our minds heal.
Exactly. And mindfulness practices like meditation or yoga can also be really helpful.
Oh, yeah.
They help us control our emotions, calm down our nervous systems, and find a sense of peace and acceptance, which can be so important when things are stressful.
It's like finding those things that help us connect with our inner strength, our ability to handle whatever comes our way. What about professional help? Do you think therapy can help build resilience?
For sure. Therapy gives you a safe space to talk about difficult emotions, learn healthy coping skills, and understand yourself better. And it's not just for people who are already struggling. It can also be a way to prepare yourself for future challenges, like giving yourself a mental health first aid kit.
I like that. It's like preventative mental health care.
Right. And speaking of first aid, one of the most important things we can do to make our communities more resilient is to be prepared for disasters.
Right.
This could mean a lot of things, like having a plan for your family, advocating for better building codes, or supporting organizations that help with disaster relief.
So it's about being proactive instead of reactive, taking steps to minimize the impact of disasters before they happen.
Exactly. And preparedness isn't just about being physically safe. It's about mental health, too. It's important to train first responders and healthcare workers to recognize and deal with psychological trauma. And we need to create mental health programs in our communities that can provide ongoing support to people who have survived disasters.
It's like building a safety net to catch people when they're falling.
Yes. And when you get down to it, I think building resilience is about giving people a sense of control.
Okay.
It's about understanding that even when things are out of our control, we still have choices. We can choose how we respond, how we cope, how we rebuild. And it's in those choices that we find our strength, our hope, our resilience.
That's a really powerful way to think about it. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to go back to something you said earlier about how even in the darkest times, there are still little bits of hope. What are some of those sparks of hope that you've seen in your work, in the research, and all the stories we've been talking about?
One of the things that always amazes me is how kind and compassionate people can be. Even when things are at their worst, people find ways to help each other, to offer support, to share whatever they have left. And those acts of kindness, those connections, they can be so powerful for both the person giving and the person receiving.
It reminds us that we're not alone, that even in the darkest times, there's still good in the world. What else gives you hope?
I'm also hopeful because people are becoming more aware of mental health and more willing to talk about trauma and its impact.
Right.
We're starting to understand that emotional wounds are just as real as physical wounds, and that getting help is a sign of strength, not weakness. And as we reduce the stigma around mental health, we open up more opportunities for healing and growth.
It's about creating a culture where it's okay to not be okay, where asking for help is seen as a normal and healthy thing to do, especially after something difficult. I really like that. Are there any other sparks of hope you want to share?
The progress in trauma research and the development of better treatments also gives me hope.
Yeah.
We're learning more about the brain, how trauma affects it, and how to help people heal.
Mm.
And while we still have a long way to go, the progress we've made in recent years makes me hopeful for the future.
It's like we're starting to understand the science behind resilience, how to use the brain's ability to heal and grow to our advantage.
Exactly. All these things, the kindness, the awareness, the advances in science, they give me hope that we can create a future where everyone is more resilient, a future where we're better prepared to face the challenges that are sure to come.
That's a beautiful vision, and I think it's a perfect place to end our conversation. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive.
Thank you for having me.
It's been quite a journey, but I feel like we've come out of it with a deeper understanding of just how much humans can suffer, but also how incredibly resilient we can be. And I think that knowledge is the first step towards building a more compassionate and resilient world. To our listeners, thank you for coming along on this exploration with us. We hope you found it insightful and maybe even inspiring. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you next time.